Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of the class. And here today, we are going to examine another key development in post-World War II America. In this portion of the class, we're examining some cardinal, central, important developments after World War II. We've done that already with our lecture on the Cold War. And here today, we're going to turn our attention to a key cardinal development within the United States in the post-World War II period, the modern civil rights movements of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. What we'll see here in lecture today is how racial minorities, women, sexual minorities rose up in the post-World War II period and demanded to be full and equal citizens of this nation. So here today in this lecture, we turn our attention to those modern civil rights movements of the post-World War II period. The best way to understand the civil rights movements that are our focus here today in this lecture is as a legal revolution. And that's a very important term because the revolution aspect of that idea, that term, speaks to how this really is a revolutionary period. How in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, you see profound changes to American law that overturn decades, in some cases centuries, of discrimination, prejudice, and other legal strictures that prevent racial minorities, women, and sexual minorities from being full and equal citizens of this nation. So this really is a revolutionary period, but it is a legal revolution, meaning laws change. As we'll see here in this lecture, the story of the modern civil rights movements is a story of a legal revolution that is revolutionary in its impact and its consequence and how it shapes and changes American history. But those changes are limited to the law. Laws change. And that's important to understand in regards to the limits of the civil rights movements. You can change a lot when you change the law, and that is the revolutionary impact, where now, as we'll see, people who had been previously denied equal access will have that access to key institutions of authority in American life. But you can only change so much when you change the law. It doesn't change attitudes, it doesn't change cultural values. And if you think about that, it helps you understand a great deal about the America you live in today, where we can look back on the successes of civil rights, how civil rights legislation and action opened up new opportunities for racial minorities, but we still live in America where racism, white supremacy still prevails in many parts of this country, and that's because the modern civil rights movement was a legal revolution, where we changed laws, opened new opportunities to racial minorities, women, sexual minorities, but it didn't necessarily reverse centuries of cultural values that were often invested in racism and white supremacy. Why does this happen? Well, a number of factors, many of which we've been leading up to for some time in our most recent lectures, where we've talked about changes in the New Deal era, in World War II, and in our most recent lecture, in the Cold War. The reason why a civil rights movement, a legal revolution, takes place in the post-World War II period is because of those antecedents and the context of the Cold War. The antecedents being the New Deal, first, where, as we talked about, in the 1930s, amidst the Great Depression, it created a larger debate about this question of who is an American. And to some very limited extent, it offered new opportunities to people who had been denied full and equal status. We saw that with Native Americans and religious minorities and women. The New Deal was a moment where Americans rethought the American community to a very limited extent, expanded that sense of us. It was a moment where the nation was urged to confront the limits in society and imagine a more generous vision of us. Then you have World War II, which, as we talked about, was also a period of confronting our nation, the ways in which we could reimagine the American community. World War II was fought in the name of freedom. We talked about the notion of 4 freedoms enunciated by Roosevelt in 1941. In World War II, we like to imagine that we were fighting against the greatest racist in human history, Adolf Hitler. But then you had those race riots. You had the internment of Japanese Americans. There were all these markers of inequality. And again, that created a larger debate that will spill over and help influence and motivate the civil rights movements that we will examine here in this lecture. So there's some antecedents, some things that come before the civil rights movements that are our focus here today that help explain why it's in this period you have these social changes. New Deal, World War II, and then you have the contemporaneous Cold War. The civil rights movements will take place in the context of a contemporaneous Cold War effort where in the rhetoric surrounding the Cold War, not always the reality, but the rhetoric, America liked to represent itself as a beacon of freedom and democracy. We were urging the world to see America as such. Civil rights advocates, African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, women, take that rhetoric that establishes America as a beacon of freedom and democracy and use it to make an argument for civil rights, feminism, gay rights. They use the very rhetoric of the Cold War to demand that America fulfill that image here at home. If we're such a beacon of freedom and democracy, why do we limit those values and opportunities for our own people? So the modern civil rights movements that ripple through America in the post-World War II period, when returning GIs come back after serving in the war and they can't vote, can't buy a home, can't attend a university, when those who fought in the Korean War in that Cold War conflict in the name of freedom and democracy return to the limits and unequal society of America, they will take to the streets and demand equality and opportunity. And a lot of the factors that explain why this happens come from these antecedents of the New Deal, World War II, that created new ideas about the American community, new ways of imagining that idea of who is an American, one of those enduring arguments in the argument without end that is American history. And then you have the Cold War, which in rhetoric was about representing America as this beacon of freedom and hope. And civil rights advocates often use that very rhetoric in their own advocacy for securing freedom and opportunity here at home. So it's this context of America in the post-World War II period, coming out of the New Deal and World War II, amidst the Cold War, living in a very unequal and unfree society that helps explain why civil rights efforts, the legal revolution, erupts in this period. One early victory in this cause for dismantling segregation, discrimination, the limits, legal limits upon equality occurred right here in California in 1946 in a California State Supreme Court decision, Mendez versus Westminster. The particulars of this case are very illuminating because they concerned two racial groups, two marginalized groups. The case Mendez versus Westminster came from a Latino family, the Mendez family, that was living on land in Westminster, California, in Orange County, not too far from us. And they wanted to send their Latino children to the local public school. But they couldn't because the closest public school barred Latinos from attending. It was for whites only, as many schools in California in 1946 were segregated. This Latino family was living on this land in Westminster, California, because the land was owned by a Japanese American family that had been locked up in an internment camp. So that's what I meant by the story. The particulars of the Mendez case represent the fate of two racial minorities in America in this period who are facing discrimination, Latinos and Japanese Americans. The Mendez family challenged the segregation in Westminster public schools, and eventually that case made its way to the California State Supreme Court. And in 1946, in the landmark Mendez versus Westminster decision, 8 years before you will have a decision like this that affects the whole of the nation, 8 years prior to that, here in California, 1946, in the Mendez decision, the California State Supreme Court ruled that segregation in California public schools was unconstitutional, that it violated the California Constitution. The head of the California State Supreme Court at that time was Earl Warren. Earl Warren will go on from serving on the California State Supreme Court to later being the Chief Justice of the United States on the U.S. Supreme Court. And so there's a direct line between the early victory in the cause of civil rights forged here in California, and later, the key victory nationwide of Brown v. Board of Education, when in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court, now headed by Earl Warren, will end segregation in all American public schools. The Brown v. Board of Education ruling in 1954 is a landmark advancement in our story here today of civil rights. It would really be the beginning point of that legal revolution that now would affect the whole of the nation. This Supreme Court decision concerned segregation based on race in public schools. The NAACP, a civil rights advocacy group, challenged the segregation policies in many states. The states were listed alphabetically on the Supreme Court case, and alphabetically first was the Brown case that concerned the discrimination in public schools in Topeka, Kansas. So this decision, this court case, this U.S. Supreme Court case, and the ultimate decision concerned a number of discriminatory policies around the country. Arguing for ending discrimination in Topeka, Kansas, and all American public schools was a young African-American lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, who will later go on to serve on the same U.S. Supreme Court that he was arguing in front of in 1954. He will go on to be the very first African-American to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. Marshall's argument as the lawyer for the NAACP, arguing to end discrimination in public schools, had three different elements to it. The first element of his argument, seeking to end segregation in public schools, concerned the 14th Amendment. He argued that such discrimination, segregation based on race, violated the 14th Amendment. Now, in our lecture on Reconstruction some time ago, we talked about that landmark achievement of the Radical Republicans in 1868, the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which grants citizenship to all born here, and also has with it the Equal Protection Clause. The 14th Amendment says all citizens of this nation are guaranteed equal protection of law. And the point I made in that lecture some time ago regarding Reconstruction was that that was a great achievement in 1868 in the cause of legal equality, and would go on to be a key factor in further efforts at true equality in American history. What the Radical Republicans accomplished in 1868 with the 14th Amendment created the legal foundation, the precedent that Thurgood Marshall, almost 100 years later, could draw upon in his argument for ending segregation based on race in public schools. So one element of Marshall's argument was based on the 14th Amendment that had been part of the Constitution since 1868. Second element of his argument was an attack on the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896. Now, also, in our lecture on Reconstruction, we learned about the Plessy decision, which in 1896 established that separate but equal doctrine, where the U.S. Supreme Court in 1896 ruled that it was perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional, to segregate based on race as long as the two public facilities were equal. Well, as I mentioned, the Brown v. Board of Education ruling was an omnibus. It was a decision that called into question a number of school districts around the country, and those school districts were listed alphabetically, with Brown being the first. The Brown case concerned segregation in public schools in Topeka, Kansas. And this is what Marshall drew upon in his argument against the separate but equal doctrine. The Brown family, in the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, had to send their African-American child to the only school in Topeka where children of color could learn. That school was located next to a rail yard, where every day railroad cars would come in at breakneck speeds, meaning that for this child to go to the only public school open to that child, the child had to cross these dangerous railroad tracks, putting her life on the line just to walk into a school and open a book. The white-only school in Topeka, Kansas, was located in a very safe area where white students did not have to put their lives on the line simply to walk into a public high school. So Marshall argues, how can you say that these two facilities are equal? The school that is open to children of color is next to a dangerous rail yard. The school that's for white children is in a safe area. These two citizens of this nation are not being treated equally. But the most remarkable, significant, and clever argument that Marshall advanced was his argument that you can't have separate but equal. He argued that racial segregation was a violation of the 14th Amendment. He argued that these two facilities aren't equal, violating the Plessy precedent. But also he argued you can't have separate but equal, because he argues in front of the Supreme Court in 1954 that the very act of segregation, the very act of taking a group and saying this particular group, because of a biological characteristic, in this case the color of their skin, is not free to live where they want, learn where they want, work where they want, shop where they want. When we as a society pass such laws, discrimination, it marks that group with a stigma that means they will never be seen as equals. If you say as a society through law that there's something wrong about this group, that they should not be able to freely move about the country, live and learn where they please, the only reason to pass such laws is to mark such a group as inferior, as suspect. There's something wrong with this group. That was Marshall's point. He said you can't have separate but equal because the very act of separation, of segregation, precludes equality. It means this group of people subject to such laws will never be seen as equal because it seems to mark them with this stigma. So Marshall makes this argument with these three different elements to it, violates the 14th Amendment, not true to the Plessy standard of equality, and that you can't have separate and equal. And the Warren Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, headed now by Earl Warren, ruled in May of 1954 in the Brown decision to end segregation in public schools. So let's tack back to the idea that we advanced at the very beginning of this lecture. What is changing here? The law. This is changing now law on a federal level from the Supreme Court. That too is a key insight to take away from this lecture. The story that I have for you today in this lecture, the story of civil rights, is not the story of one day every white person in 1954 waking up and saying, you know what, blacks and whites should be equal. That's not what happens. This isn't about changing hearts and minds. It isn't about changing attitudes. It isn't about changing cultural values. If that was the case, if one day in 1954 everyone saw racism as wrong, well, America would be very different today. What's changing isn't attitudes, it's the law. And those changes are coming from the federal government. This is a key point I've made in previous lectures, and we return to here today. The story of civil rights in American history, whether it's Reconstruction, here the modern civil rights movements, or efforts today, that's the story of big government. It's the story of the federal government forcing states and individuals to do what they don't want to do, treat everyone equally under law. If you just leave it up to societal attitudes, that will never happen. Instead, you have to force individuals to do what they are not inclined to do, treat everyone equally under law. So the Brown decision represents all of these elements I'm stressing to you here today about what exactly happens in the civil rights revolutions. It's revolutionary because, in this case, it ends decades, almost a century, of segregation in public schools. But where's that change coming from? It's coming from the federal government through the law. And that speaks to both the revolutionary impact of this and its limits. We're changing laws, but we're not necessarily changing attitudes, cultural values. We are not reversing centuries of investment by some in racism and white supremacy. But the change is here, it's in law, it's truly significant, and that change is coming from the federal government, because that's the only way civil rights goes forward. It isn't about changing hearts and minds. It isn't about one day everyone waking up and holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Guess what? That day has yet to come in American history. It's instead about the federal government saying, here through the Supreme Court, you have to do this, forcing states and individuals to do what they're not inclined to do. So the Supreme Court, in the vanguard of change, the federal government, in the necessary and vital role as forcing this change. Though the Brown decision only applied to public education, the rest of Jim Crow segregation is still out there in 1954. It was still legal to say blacks can't shop at the store, or an employer to say we don't hire Latinos, or labor unions to say we won't have Asians in our membership. The only thing that changed with Brown was public education. But many saw this as the beginning of change, and that's why the decision in May of 1954 was celebrated as a second emancipation. And that's because it was returning the federal government to this role that it had failed to play since Reconstruction. As we learned in our lecture on Reconstruction, Civil War ends in 1865, slavery ends in 1865, and for a brief moment, the radical Republicans take control of Reconstruction and steer America towards radical change, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment. As I mentioned in that lecture, during that period of Reconstruction, African American men can vote, former slaves are elected to the U.S. House. But then we also learned in that lecture, soon after that, in the 1870s, the federal government turned its back on equality and freedom for all. And that opened the door to 100 years of Jim Crow, apartheid, segregation. But now the federal government is back in that necessary role as the agent of change. And that's why many saw this as the second beat in a long delayed rhythm, a second emancipation. The Brown decision only applied to public education. That speaks to its limits. It speaks to how the change in this period is slow and incremental. But even that caused great blowback and resistance. Many southern states refused to open their doors to black learners. There were many public school systems in the South that just shut down. They said, we're not going to educate any students, white or black, if it means black and white students learning in the same room. And that's why it took Dwight David Eisenhower in 1957 to call on the 101st Airborne to desegregate a public high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. The federal government had to play that role because there was such resistance, particularly in the South, to even this modest step towards desegregating America. Of course, when we talk about public education, we are talking about that stubborn, enduring question, argument in American history. Who is an American? When we talk about public education, we're talking about the public and who falls under that banner of we the people. Brown urged us to expand that. And in doing so, it helped inspire other efforts at dismantling Jim Crow, apartheid. Brown only applied to public education, but it was a way of imagining a larger vision of the public, including racial minorities, under that banner of we the people. And in doing so, it inspired other efforts going forward to dismantle what was left of Jim Crow. A year after the Brown decision, Rosa Parks, an NAACP activist, refused to follow a law that treated her as second class, as inferior. She refused to abide by racial segregation and discrimination in public transportation on a public transportation bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest for refusing to abide by racial discrimination, segregation, sparked civil disobedience. It sparked a peaceful protest against the public transportation system in Montgomery, Alabama, the Montgomery bus boycott, where for 381 days, more than a year, the African American citizens of Montgomery, Alabama, galvanized, unified, feeling a sense of us and solidarity, walked to work, walked to school, walked to church, refusing to drop a dime, refusing to patronize a public transportation system that did not serve the public. It segregated the public. They relied on an informal network of taxis where people carpooled, said, oh, you go to that church, I'll give you a ride. Anything it took to avoid patronizing, supporting, dropping a dime within a public transportation system that again treated you as second class. So from Rosa Parks' arrest came the Montgomery bus boycott. Now there's a lot here to think about. First off, let's start with Rosa Parks. You may have learned that she accidentally created this change, this revolution, because she refused to give up her seat that day because her feet hurt, as if it was all an accident. That's bullshit. That's nonsense. In fact, it's deliberate bullshit. That story was concocted to make Rosa Parks less threatening to white America. The idea of an assertive African-American woman who knows her rights was very daunting and unnerving to many white Americans in 1956. So there was this deliberate effort to create this image of her as meek and mousy and quiet and oops, accidentally changed America because her feet hurt. Even today, America is not quite ready for an assertive African-American woman who knows her rights. So if you've learned that about Rosa Parks, it was a deliberate effort to make her softer in the image of many, but it's nonsense. It is bullshit. Rosa Parks was an activist. She was very active in the local chapter of the NAACP. She knew exactly what she was doing that day. She was asserting herself as a full and equal American. From this came a boycott, a protest. And that makes us think about the place of the Montgomery bus boycott in the larger story of American history. America was born out of boycotts, rebellions against the King of England, as he was seen as a threat to their individual rights. And there's a long continuity in American history of breaking the law in the name of a higher law. That's Henry David Thoreau refusing to pay his poll tax in protest of the U.S.-Mexican War. That's abolitionists helping slaves run away. And that's Rosa Parks, acting in that same vein, that same tradition. It goes back to events like the Boston Tea Party in the very beginning of America. There's a long history in America of civil disobedience, of resistance to threats to freedom. Rosa Parks is part of that. The other thing that is important here is that you see this sense of solidarity among African Americans in the Montgomery bus boycott, banding together, creating this informal network of taxis, helping people. Through the heat of an Alabama winter, of a summer, through the cold of an Alabama winter, they walked. While they walked, they were spat upon, pelted with batteries called the N-word, but they persisted and they won, because the Montgomery bus boycott does not end until November of 1956, when that same Supreme Court, look where change is coming from. How is change coming? That same Supreme Court that 2 years earlier had ruled in the Brown decision, declared that segregation in public transportation was unconstitutional. Another brick in the wall, the edifice of Jim Crow fell. What you had now in November of 1956 was the U.S. Supreme Court ending segregation in another element of public life. Think about the terms again. What the Supreme Court said in November of 1956 was that segregation in public transportation was unconstitutional. Public transportation, like public education, concerns this issue of who is one of us. So another key victory, a victory that again speaks to some of the broader contours, ideas that we're expressing in this lecture about change, what changes, where the change comes from, about ideas about the American public and community, but also there's a lot here in the larger story of American history we've expressed in this class. From these achievements, Brown, Montgomery bus boycott, comes a wave of protests. America in the late 50s, early 60s was awash in protests, where racial minorities in peaceful protests, boycotts, sit-ins, demanded what should already be their right: to be treated as a free and equal member of the society amidst a Cold War where we claimed to be a beacon of freedom and democracy. Many who were active in the civil rights efforts were veterans of World War II who sacrificed and served for this nation and then came back to an America where they couldn't vote, couldn't buy a home, couldn't attend a university, couldn't walk into a library and pull a book off the shelf. The modern civil rights movements that we're describing in this lecture would see racial minorities demand not something extra, not something beyond. What they wanted was simply what should already be their right: to be voters, to pursue an American dream open to all, to be full and equal members of this nation. The zenith of this effort in the late 50s, early 60s, that is marked by protests, boycotts, sit-ins, was a massive demonstration in the summer of 1963, the March on Washington. Now, in a previous lecture, we learned about A. Philip Randolph, civil rights leader, who during World War II proposed a march on Washington, a massive display of solidarity and civil disobedience where African American workers would walk off the job protesting wage discrimination. We learned in that lecture A. Philip Randolph doesn't have that march in World War II because President Franklin Roosevelt responded with Executive Order 8802, ending wage discrimination in all factories with government contracts. In 1963, A. Philip Randolph would have his march. He organized and led the March on Washington in the summer of 1963, where 250,000 Americans, black, white, Latino, Asian American, would descend on the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and demand what again should already be their right, freedom and equality. In particular, the March on Washington in the summer of 1963 was designed to build support for a Civil Rights Act that was being thwarted, stopped, halted in Congress, a Civil Rights Act that would end what was left of Jim Crow, end racial discrimination in public life. To build support for that Civil Rights Act, that civil rights legislation that Southern congressmen, senators of both parties were attempting to thwart, A. Philip Randolph had his march on Washington, 250,000 Americans, amidst the Cold War, a moment where we claim to be this beacon of freedom and democracy, march on the nation's capital, what is imagined to be the capital of democracy around the world, and demanded some democracy here at home. Most memorable event at that March on Washington was an evocative speech given by a very young and charismatic preacher, Martin Luther King Jr., who on the steps of Lincoln Memorial gave his I Have a Dream speech. And that's usually what's most remembered about March on Washington. But unfortunately, what's often forgot about the March on Washington is the slogan. The slogan for the march. The slogan for the march was jobs and freedom. What was key to King, A. Philip Randolph, and so many who marched that day was that freedom means more than just voting, means more than just sitting at a lunch counter and being able to order BLT. Freedom means jobs, and this too helps to tie together many of the big themes we're talking about in this class. As we've talked about in previous lectures, the cause of civil rights for African Americans in U.S. history is often tied to economic opportunity. In our lecture on Reconstruction, we learned about the Freedman vision. After the Civil War, former slaves wanted 40 acres and a mule because that's really what freedom meant, economic opportunity. We also learned that those hopes were dashed, that slaves never received any compensation for their lifetime of toil, the labor that made America so wealthy. We learned in a previous lecture on World War I about the Great Migration, about how African Americans were leaving the South during World War I seeking good-paying jobs in factories, only to be discriminated against in employment, subject to residential discrimination, and beaten in race riots during the World War I era. So we've seen in previous episodes and previous moments how for African Americans, freedom meant jobs. That's what really makes you free. That's what really gives you a sense of independence, autonomy. And we forget that the March on Washington was about jobs. Dr. King in his I Have a Dream speech, he gives this evocative speech about blacks and whites living side by side. But he also talked about jobs, education, housing, the things that really make you free. We often forget that. We often forget that aspect of King, how he was an advocate for affirmative action, how he called for a federal jobs program. Jobs and freedom, because what makes you free? Economic opportunity. Here are a couple images that I offer to you from what we've talked about so far in this lecture. On the left, the Montgomery bus boycott. And you could see here African Americans walking to work, walking to school. We Southern Californians can really appreciate the sacrifice here because we don't walk anywhere. Hell no, right? Your friend lives up the street, you drive to his house, right? We don't carpool. But in Montgomery in 1955, African Americans walked through the, again, heat of an Alabama summer, the cold of an Alabama winter. They were spat upon, they were called the N-word, but they kept marching until they won. On the right, here's an image from the March on Washington, which I was just describing, and it's an image of A. Philip Randolph. There he is in the forefront, holding hands with Dr. King. What I want to call to your attention in this photograph is when you look at the signs here, you see that word jobs, jobs, housing. And again, that's kind of drifted down the memory hole. When we imagine Dr. King, we imagine his vivid imagery, the I Have a Dream speech. But Dr. King was an advocate for economic opportunity, economic equality. When he was killed in Memphis in 1968, he was in Memphis with striking garbage workers. He was standing side by side with garbage men who wanted higher pay, better working conditions, dignity on the job. When Dr. King was assassinated by a white supremacist in 1968, he was formulating what would have been his second March on Washington. He wanted to do it again in 68 with the Poor People's Campaign. Dr. King in the late 60s turned his attention to larger issues of economic opportunity, educational opportunity. He called for a massive jobs program like the New Deal. So it's important to understand that Dr. King was an advocate not just for racial equality, but for a true freedom that came from jobs, education, housing, the things that truly make you free. And that reminds us of the limits of civil rights. In the civil rights era that we're describing here, African Americans and other racial minorities secure the right to vote, they secure the right and opportunity to walk into a store and buy something. But the larger goals of housing, education, jobs, those have often been muted and thwarted even here in the 21st century. As I mentioned, the March on Washington that we've now described and seen a photograph from was designed to build support for a Civil Rights Act that was thwarted and stopped, halted in Congress in that summer of 1963. Southern congressmen and senators from both parties had been successful in preventing the passage of that Civil Rights Act. In the summer of 1963, you have the March on Washington, designed to build support, public support for a Civil Rights Act that was being thwarted, gummed up, halted in Congress. Also in 1963, November of that year, months after the March on Washington, President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. Kennedy had said that if Congress passed that Civil Rights Act, he would sign it. Now, Kennedy was a Democrat. He was a member of the Democratic Party. He was a Democratic president. But the Democratic Party had long been the party of the South. It was said in this period of the 1950s, 1960s, that the South is the solid South, solid in support for the Democratic Party. This goes back to the Civil War. Lincoln was a Republican, so white Southerners supported the Democratic Party, and they did almost for 100 years. But Kennedy was a Democrat, and he was trying to pull his party, the Democratic Party, away from its long commitment to segregation, discrimination, and remake it as the party of civil rights. Kennedy was a Northern Democrat from Massachusetts, and that's why he was committed to signing the Civil Rights Act. But of course, he never has that opportunity because he's assassinated in Dallas. Now, when he's assassinated in Dallas, initially, before we found out who was responsible for that assassination, many Americans assumed it was the Klan. Kennedy was in a southern city, Dallas. He had come out as a strong advocate for civil rights. He had promised to sign the Civil Rights Act into law if it was passed. And so when he was shot in the southern city, many people just assumed it was the Klan who was killing Kennedy for his support of civil rights. When he shot, his then widow, Jackie Kennedy, said, "Oh my God, they killed him," because she assumed it was, again, the Klan, white supremacists. It later turned out it was a lone wolf. It was Lee Harvey Oswald who killed Kennedy not because of civil rights, but because Oswald harbored a grudge regarding Kennedy's policies towards the Soviet Union and Cuba. But at the time, most people assumed it was the Klan because Kennedy was in this effort to remake the Democratic Party and the party of civil rights. So Kennedy's killed, and he becomes a martyr. His vice president, Lyndon Johnson, takes over and makes the Civil Rights Act the cause of Kennedy as a martyr. If he's a martyr, if he died for a cause, that cause was civil rights. And Lyndon Johnson, using his political skills, his will, his presence, he was the type of guy who would grab you by the lapels and just impose upon you in many ways, worked to get the Civil Rights Act passed, and he signed it into law in 1964, the landmark Civil Rights Act of that year, that ends Jim Crow segregation, ends Jim Crow discrimination. What the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did was end discrimination based on race in public life. No longer could you as a private employer have a sign that say, we don't serve Latinos, we don't serve Filipinos, we don't serve African Americans. As a labor union, you can no longer say, we don't have blacks as members. The Civil Rights Act ended what was left of Jim Crow. Now, in previous slides, we've seen its slow dismantling, Brown, the Montgomery bus boycott. But in 1963, when you have the March on Washington, there were still so many ways in which racial minorities were subject to discrimination. That ends with the Civil Rights Act. Now, let's think about some of the larger themes in this lecture. What's changing here? The law. The Civil Rights Act says you cannot discriminate based on race in public life. Where's that change coming from? The federal government. This is passed by Congress and signed into law by Lyndon Johnson. So the Civil Rights Act, again, a legal revolution. And it is revolutionary because it upends 100 years of apartheid. It ends Jim Crow. It ends legal discrimination in American life based on race. Profound, remarkable, significant. But where is that change coming from? It's coming from the federal government. And how is the change coming? It's coming in a change of law. When Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act into law, he says, I fear we've lost the South for a generation. By which he meant that the South, which had long been the solid South, solid in its support for the Democratic Party, would shift now towards the Republican Party. When we think of states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana today, we think of red state America, right? We're going to have a presidential election later this year. But you know what? They can color in those states now because those states, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, those states today are so loyal to the Republican Party. Well, that shift away from whites in the South loyal to the Democratic Party to the Republican Party begins here in the 60s with civil rights, where now the Democratic Party was the party of civil rights. It will be a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, who signs into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, which I referenced in our lecture on the Cold War, that opened our borders to immigrants from around the world. It was a Democratic president who did that. And as a result, whites in the South will shift their loyalty towards the Republican Party, and the Republican Party will work hard, and a lecture will deliver soon, to win over disaffected whites and fold them into their movement, and that helps explain why those states today are red states, solid in their support for the Republican Party. Civil Rights Act, remarkable, profound, significant, but there was one lacuna, one missing element, one thing not specifically and explicitly addressed in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, voting rights. That lacuna, that missing element, would become glaring when in early 1965, there were a wave of attacks around the country where white police officers, Klansmen, would beat and attack peaceful protests who were seeking the right to vote. In early 1965, 3 civil rights workers, 2 of them white, were slain by the Klan in Philadelphia, Mississippi. That would lead to the Voting Rights Act the next year of 1965. It was clear with the bloodshed, with the assassinations of civil rights workers who were merely registering blacks to vote in the South, that white supremacists in the South were willing to use violence, terrorism is violence for a political end, to prevent American citizens from voting. So again, if you think about some of what we stressed in this lecture, what are civil rights advocates seeking? They're seeking the right to vote, which should already be the right of all Americans, particularly in a nation that we like to imagine as a beacon of democracy. The willingness of the Klan and other groups to use violence to prevent that in the march at Selma, where John Lewis, a young African-American advocate for civil rights, was beaten, his skull fractured. John Lewis still alive, still in Congress today, and you could see the scar on his head, where he has a very young man, the same age likely you are. He was beaten and attacked simply because he wanted to vote in this country. You had that march in Selma. You had the slaying of civil rights workers by the Klan in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Well, that willingness to use violence demanded action, and it came with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, it's important to note the Voting Rights Act of 1965 does not give racial minorities the right to vote. They already, under law, had that right to vote. That goes back to, again, one of the amendments we saw in the Reconstruction era, the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on race. So you can have laws that say blacks or Latinos or Asian Americans can't vote. But we also learned in that lecture on Reconstruction that with that came all sorts of efforts to get around that through poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses that made it effectively impossible for people of color to vote in this nation. So with the 15th Amendment, racial minorities had the right to vote, but they couldn't exercise it. The Voting Rights Act allows them to exercise it. What it offers is a federal guarantee for the right to vote. What the Voting Rights Act did was it put the federal government in charge of local elections in parts of the country that had a history of voter discrimination, of using poll taxes, understanding clauses, open violence and intimidation from preventing people of color from voting. So the Voting Rights Act doesn't give people the right to vote, it just protects their right to exercise it. It's again about federal government. It's an act of federal legislation from Congress signed into law by that same president, Lyndon Johnson, who signed into law the Civil Rights Act. And it's about federal government taking over elections, saying to Alabama, Mississippi, Arizona, you can't run your own elections because when you do, you prevent people from voting. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 put the federal government in charge of those elections. So it's another story of big government, the necessary, vital role the federal government has to play in securing equality for all. If we leave it up to Alabama and Mississippi, they're not going to let people vote. I've mentioned many times in this class that the history of America is not the history of democracy. That from the very beginning and continuing through American history, there have been efforts to deny people, American citizens, the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is a landmark achievement in helping make America more democratic. If you want to see America as a democracy, that history does not begin in 1776. It arguably only begins in 1965, roughly 50 years ago. But recently, just in the last few years, the U.S. Supreme Court, the current court, the Roberts Court, has ruled in a way that has rolled back and undermined the Voting Rights Act. There are parts of this country today, 2020, that were once subject to the Voting Rights Act that are no longer subject to it, and they're allowed to run their own elections. And what have they done? They've closed polling stations. They've passed laws that require you to get some ID that you can only secure from this office that's open from 2:30 to 3 o'clock every third Friday. All of these onerous restrictions trying to prevent people from voting. So if the history of America is not the history of democracy, but the history of the fight for democracy, guess what? That fight goes on, and everyone in this class is an heir to that fight. You have inherited it because it's an ongoing effort. You cannot imagine that just because we passed a Voting Rights Act in 1965, now everyone can vote, we have a democracy, and we can move forward and spend our days watching Netflix. We have seen in our own lifetime, in just the last few years, an effort to undermine the Voting Rights Act. In the most recent presidential election in 2016, there were people in line for 8 hours to vote. If you have to stand in line for 8 hours to vote, that's deliberate. That's designed to prevent you from voting. So the history of America is not the history of democracy. It's the history of the fight for democracy. And that fight goes on, and everyone alive today has to keep that fight going forward. Other racial minorities were inspired by the efforts of African Americans that we've described here. And a man who would help lead the effort for a more equal America for Latinos and Asian Americans, Cesar Chavez, who was deeply influenced by Martin Luther King Jr., and in particular his strategy of nonviolent but persistent protest. Chavez was the son of migrant farm workers, and he saw in the experience of his parents racial discrimination, denying them basic rights, namely the right of assembly and the right of free speech. His parents were migrant workers, farm workers, and there were all of these efforts in the early 20th century, in the lifespan of Chavez's parents, to prevent farm workers from unionizing, from assembling in like-minded groups and speaking out in favor of higher wages, better working conditions. In the early 20th century, a billion-dollar industry develops here in the Southwest, particularly here in California. Citrus industry, agriculture. The growers, the landowners who helped develop that industry, worked diligently to deny their workers the right to form unions. In 1936, there's an incident called the Citrus War here in Orange County, where striking agricultural workers, most of them Latino or Asian American, were beaten back onto the job, forced to return to work by the local police departments in Fullerton, California, in Brea, California, cities, again, not too far from us. That demonstrates the use of violence and intimidation to prevent unionization. Chavez saw that experience in his parents' lives, and he wanted to now work to allow farm workers, most of them again Latino, Filipino American, to finally secure that basic liberty and right of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and form labor unions. So again, it's about racial minorities seeking what should already be their right, equality and opportunity. Chavez joined with Dolores Huerta and helped form the United Farm Workers, an effort to unionize farm workers in the Southwest, most of them Latino and Asian American. He launched a boycott using the techniques that were successful African Americans that we've talked about. It's very common here in California in the 60s and early 70s to see t-shirts, posters that said boycott grapes. He wanted American consumers to refuse to buy grapes, put pressure on the growers to recognize the right of their workers, American citizens, to form a union. So now you got that calculus. Whose side are you on? Do you buy grapes and side with the billionaire growers? Or do you refuse to buy grapes and side with Chavez and other Americans who simply want the right of assembly, the right to form a union, the right to speak out, and really secure greater opportunity at the American dream? If you form a union, it's designed to help secure higher wages, better working conditions, a chance to vault into the middle class, buy a house, send your kids to college. Chavez, Huerta, they brought their boycott nationwide. And ultimately, they forced growers to negotiate with these unions, recognize the right of their workers to unionize, and in doing so, secure for the members of these unions higher wages, better working conditions, a chance at the American dream. So the story of Chavez is a story of peaceful protests. It's the story of boycotts, that very American methodology of putting pressure on the powerful. It's a story of determination. It's a story of raising visibility for a group who had long been marginalized and subject to discrimination, racism, and violence, as we talked about in that 1936 Citrus War. And it's a story ultimately of victory secured by these methods, as by the 1970s, the United Farm Workers is recognized. The growers ultimately negotiate with Chavez in an effort to offer to these American citizens what should already be their right: freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and a chance at higher wages, better working conditions, a chance at the American dream. So we've talked a lot so far in this lecture about civil rights as an effort of racial minorities, as an effort of African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans. But civil rights as an effort to create an America where all are equal, where all have the freedom to pursue a life of their own making, can also be a way of understanding another key development in this period, the modern feminist movement of this period. The narrative for women is very similar to the story we have enunciated here and in previous lectures about racial minorities. During World War II, as we talked about, women got greater opportunities to sacrifice, serve, contribute to society. We talked about Rosie the Riveter, women on the factory floor, earning wages, and in doing so getting a taste of economic freedom, economic opportunity, self-determination. We talked about how women doing heavy labor in World War II challenged and revealed the false sexism, demonstrating that women could do anything. But after World War II, women were encouraged to contain and limit their ambitions. Containment is American foreign policy in the 40s and 50s. We talked about that in our lecture on the Cold War, the effort to contain the spread and influence of communism. But containment is a great way to understand domestic life in the 1950s, where certain Americans, racial minorities, sexual minorities, and women were told to contain their ambitions and freedom. In the 40s and 50s, American women, many of whom had sacrificed and served in World War II, many of whom got a taste of greater freedom and opportunity, were told to forego a career, forego an education, to get married, move off to the suburbs, and spend their lives scrubbing floors and wiping poopy butts, to be wives and mothers. So in the 40s and 50s, containment, that foreign policy, manifest here at home, not just in a Red Scare led by McCarthy, but in the gendered ideologies and messages of this period, where women were urged to contain their ambitions, their pursuit of a career, their pursuit of an education. And then here comes the 60s. Here comes protest and civil rights. And women listened to the demands of racial minorities and heard something that was very applicable to their experience. They too wanted to be free and equal members of this nation. And from that comes the modern feminist movement. Women taking to the streets, demanding the same thing: freedom, opportunity, equality, pursuing independence, a life of their own making. A key moment in that effort came in 1963, this fateful year, the year of the March on Washington, this year of Kennedy's assassination. In 1963, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which is often cited as the catalyst for the modern feminist movement. In this book, she articulates the problem with no name. What's the problem with no name? Well, first, it was a problem with no name because no one had ever seen it as a problem, identified it as such. Friedan is the first to describe this problem. The problem was that Betty Friedan did aspire to a career. She aspired to a career in journalism. But she quickly realized that she could never be the journalist that she was capable of, rise in that profession, contribute to American society through that profession, because after a long day working as a journalist, writing, researching, editing stories, she came home for what she described as her second shift, where she was expected to cook, clean, care for the children, while her husband sat on his ass and drank a martini. The idea here is that men, because they are liberated from those domestic tasks, because society only charges women with the duties of cooking, cleaning, and childcare, men can devote all of their energy, all of their focus to their career. And that, according to Betty Friedan, is why men are in charge in society in 1963. Why men are CEOs of corporations, why men are on the faculty of prestigious universities. It's because half of the population, women, have been tasked with these duties that men are liberated from. Friedan argued in this book, if it was fair, if it was equal, if women had the same opportunities men did, women would be CEOs of corporations. Women would be on the faculty of prestigious universities. Women would be in Congress. And that's how Betty Friedan was very forward-looking, very prescient, because that's exactly what happens. Thanks to the efforts of Betty Friedan and feminists, in the 60s and 70s, laws change and women get opportunities to pursue a career in education. And today, women are CEOs of corporations. Women are on the faculty of prestigious universities. Women are in Congress. Today, we have best-selling books like The End of Men. Are Men Necessary? Today, the majority of bachelor's degrees are awarded to women. We have seen the ascendance of women in the last few decades. In a college class like this, there are more women than men. Things are going to change in the American labor force in the decades ahead. And that's why you have best-selling books with titles like Are Men Necessary? The End of Men. Women are now out earning their husbands. In many American households, women are the breadwinners. Women are earning the majority of bachelor's degrees. Women are looking at men. They're not earning much money. They don't help out much around the house. They just sit on the couch, fart, and play Xbox. And women are saying, I don't need that in my life. So fellas, guess what? You better study, better work hard, because you're about to be outnumbered. Friedan was very prescient in that way. She wrote this book that articulated her own personal challenge, the problem with no name. But what happens is, when women read this book, They say, your problem is my problem. I too want a career. I too want an education, but I'm told to get married, move off to the suburbs, wipe poopy butts, and scrub floors. She's flooded with letters by women who say, you've identified a larger problem in society. So Friedan writes this book, it connects, it resonates with so many American women, and it gives birth to this movement, the modern feminist movement. Problem for Betty Friedan was she had written this book that was a huge success. It galvanized American women. It raised their awareness. But she struggled to find a job because whenever she would go looking for a job in journalism, the person behind the desk that had the power to hire her was always a man. And he may not have read The Feminine Mystique, but he knew its core argument. The only reason why you're here, the only reason why you're in charge of this newspaper or magazine is because you're scared to compete with us, women. So she had a hard time finding work, and therefore she founded her own magazine, Ms. Magazine. She founded NOW, the National Organization for Women, which would be the leading voice for feminist causes in the second half of the 20th century. NOW, a National Organization for Women, founded by Friedan and other feminists, advocated for opportunity in education, employment. It argued for reproductive rights, decriminalization of abortion and birth control so women can decide if and when they want to become mothers. It critiqued the beauty culture that seemed to be dominated by men, cosmetic companies, Hollywood, that seemed to assert that women's only worth was in their physical looks and appeal to men. On the pages of Ms. Magazine, those arguments were made. Also in 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, which mandated that in federal jobs, men and women be paid the same. Now, today there's still a gender gap in pay in the private sector, and there are efforts to narrow that gap and create true equality in terms of pay, and those struggles and efforts continue, and likely they'll get better in the decades ahead as women continue to dominate the labor force. But in 1963, in federal jobs, you had the Equal Pay Act. Marcia Janeway was a member of NOW. She too published on the pages of Ms. Magazine, and she in particular zeroed in on that beauty culture that told American women what was beautiful. She said the beauty culture, beauty industry, cosmetic companies, they're all run by men. And they tell women what is beautiful in a way that urges them to look as different than men as possible. They tell women that beauty comes from having long hair, wearing short skirts, walking around on heels, and smearing your face in makeup. Whereas men are supposed to have short hair, wear pants, suits and ties, and not fuss with their looks too much. Janeway said we could remedy sexism by moving to an androgynous society where men and women look exactly the same. Her idea here was, if I don't know you're a woman, because I can't tell the difference between men and women, I can't treat you differently. She said the beauty industry is so invested in urging American women to look as different than men as possible. So let's move to an androgynous society as an effort to end sexism, where women start dressing more like men start dressing more like women, and we meet in the middle. Well, if you think this is funny or ridiculous or hard to imagine, think about what's happened since the 1970s, where today nobody raises an eyebrow, nobody thinks it's shocking if a woman has short hair or a man has long hair. In the 60s, there were many public places where American women couldn't appear wearing pants. If you showed up to jury duty wearing pants, the judge had the power to send you home and make you wear a skirt. That's what happened in this country not too long ago, but today no one raises an eyebrow if a woman wears pants in public life. Men now, they're manscaping, they're plucking hair, they're smearing creams and lotions all over their body. It's how men have compensated for their declining economic fortunes, by becoming peacocks. It's our only hope, really, in an age where, again, we have best-selling books titled The End of Men. So Janeway was probably very also prescient. The other landmark work of the modern feminist movement was published in 1970. It was written by Kate Millett, who passed away recently last year. Her book was Sexual Politics. And she argues in this book that everything in American life was dedicated to keeping women below men. She argues our political system was designed by men to deny political power to women in an age where American women couldn't vote until 1920 if they were white, 1965 if they were of color. She says the founding fathers were all fathers. They were all men, and they didn't create democracy. They created a system that concentrated political power in the hands of men. She argued our economic system, capitalism, was designed to concentrate power in the hands of men and keep women below men. A rather provocative thing to assert in 1970 during the Cold War, when we were told that capitalism makes you free. Not according to Kate Millett. She said capitalism, the American economic system, was designed by men to keep women below men. She argued that the predominant American religion, Christianity, was also used to keep women below men, with the Bible often cited, urging women to cleave to their husbands, cleave to their fathers. And as the title indicates, she says, even the sexual act itself, even sexual intercourse, is all about men on top. She says when a man's having sex with a woman, he's saying, I'm in charge, I'm on top. I know she wasn't thinking of all the kinky ways you guys are doing it. She was thinking of the missionary position where men are on top. And therefore, the sexual act itself is political. Millett argues in this book, the only reason why women think they want to have sex with a man is because they've been told that by a man. Hey, this is what you'll like. This will be great, right? Millett said, if women want to have a good time, a real good orgasm, they should get together with other women. Men, they don't know what the hell they're doing. They're out there banging away, hoping for what's best. But women have access to the equipment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they know how to use that equipment. And so Millett argues that women could break free from patriarchy by refusing to have sex with men and having a much more pleasurable time with other women. Kate Millett, Sexual Politics, the other landmark work of another key social development in this period, the modern feminist movement.